Good evening. I am Clara Nightwell. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara. That demon is seized. I looked for that she'll see it.
Political power often presents itself as necessary, but rarely does it explain its limits. Tonight, we turn to a thinker who asked a difficult question. How should power be restrained?
A question shaped by civil war, revolution, and contested authority in 17th century England.
We are speaking about John Locke,
A philosopher who argued that government exists not to dominate but to protect.
Then let us begin with the instability that made limits necessary.
John Locke was born in 1632. In a country already divided by political and religious tension, England would soon descend into civil war between Parliament and the monarchy. The conflict ended with the execution of King Charles I in 1649, an event that permanently altered ideas about sovereignty.
So absolute authority was no longer unquestioned.
Exactly. The traditional claim that kings ruled by divine right had been violently disrupted. After a brief republican period under Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy was restored, but trust in unrestrained rule had weakened. Locke grew to adulthood in this atmosphere of constitutional uncertainty. Educated at Oxford, he initially trained in medicine and natural philosophy, disciplines shaped by empirical observation rather than inherited authority.
So experience shaped his method.
Yes, Locke's empiricism in philosophy parallels his political thinking. Just as knowledge must be grounded in experience, political authority must be grounded in consent. His association with Anthony Ashley Cooper, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, placed him near the center of political opposition to absolute monarchy. When political tensions intensified, Locke was forced into exile in the Netherlands.
So his philosophy developed under pressure.
Yes. The experience of instability, exile, and contested legitimacy sharpened his question: what makes political power rightful rather than merely forceful? Locke's central political work, Two Treatises of Government, was written during this period of instability. The first treatise dismantles the argument that kings rule by divine inheritance from Adam. Locke methodically rejects the idea that political authority is a natural extension of paternal authority.
So power is not inherited by birthright.
Exactly. In the second treatise, Locke builds a different foundation. He begins with the idea of a state of nature, where individuals exist without a political ruler but still possess natural rights. These rights include life, liberty, and property, and they exist prior to government.
So government does not create rights.
No. Government is formed to protect rights that already belong to individuals. Because enforcement in the state of nature is uncertain, individuals consent to establish a political community. Consent becomes the mechanism that transforms natural freedom into legitimate authority.
So authority depends on agreement.
Yes. For Locke, no ruler is legitimate without the consent of the governed. This framework directly challenges absolute monarchy by redefining sovereignty as conditional rather than permanent. Locke's argument becomes sharper when he explains what happens if government exceeds its authority. Because political power is granted through consent, it remains limited by the purpose for which it was created. That purpose, in Locke's view, is the preservation of natural rights.
So protection defines legitimacy.
Exactly. When a government fails to protect life, liberty, and property, it violates the trust placed in it. Locke describes political authority as a fiduciary power, meaning it is held in trust for the people. If that trust is broken, the people retain the right to withdraw their consent.
So resistance becomes justified.
Yes, Locke argues that rebellion is not chaos when directed against unlawful power, but a restoration of rightful order. This position distinguishes him from Hobbes, who feared that allowing resistance would return society to civil war. Locke responds that unchecked power poses a greater danger than conditional authority. For him, limits are not weaknesses of government, but safeguards of legitimacy.
So stability depends on restraint.
Exactly. A government that respects its limits maintains trust. One that ignores them invites dissolution. At this point, Locke moves from abstract principles to institutional design. If political power is limited by purpose, then its structure must reflect that limitation. Locke distinguishes between legislative power and executive power. The legislative power creates general laws. It represents the collective will of the community. The executive power enforces those laws and manages practical affairs.
So power is divided.
Yes, though not yet a full theory of separation of powers in the later constitutional sense. Locke clearly insists that concentration of authority increases the risk of abuse. The legislature itself, he argues, is supreme only in the sense that it expresses the will of the community. Even that supremacy is conditional. Laws must aim at the common good and must not violate natural rights. Legislative authority cannot arbitrarily seize property, suspend laws at will, or rule without established procedures. Locke places particular emphasis on property, defining it not merely as material possession, but as the product of one's labor. When individuals mix their labor with natural resources, they create rightful claims over them. Government exists in part to secure these claims against arbitrary interference.
So economic security becomes political security.
Exactly. Without protection of property, individuals lack independence, and dependence weakens political freedom. Locke also introduces the concept of prerogative, the discretionary power of the executive to act without exit law in emergencies. This may appear contradictory to limitation, but Locke insists that prerogative remains subject to public judgment. If prerogative is abused, it becomes tyranny, and the right of resistance re-emerges. In this framework, limitation does not eliminate authority. It defines the conditions under which authority is legitimate. Locke's political design rests on a balance between trust and accountability. Citizens trust institutions to protect rights. Institutions remain accountable to the citizens who granted that trust.
So limits preserve authority rather than weaken it.
Yes, for Locke, power without limits decays into fear. Power within limits sustains legitimacy. The result is not the absence of government, but a government grounded in law, consent, and restraint. In the final movement of Locke's political thought, the question becomes historical rather than theoretical. What happens when a society actually attempts to limit power through law and consent? Locke wrote in the shadow of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when James II was removed and William and Mary assumed the throne under constitutional conditions. This event was not framed as chaos but as restoration. Parliament declared that the monarch had violated the trust of the people.
So theory aligned with political change.
Yes, Locke's framework provided intellectual justification for limiting monarchy without abandoning government. Power was no longer viewed as sacred inheritance, but as conditional authority dependent on performance. This shift altered how sovereignty was understood across Europe. In the American colonies, Locke's language of natural rights and consent would later shape arguments for independence. The claim that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed echoes his central thesis. Yet Locke's theory also introduced tension. If consent is the foundation of authority, how is consent measured, renewed, or withdrawn? If property is central to political independence, what of those without property?
So limitation does not resolve inequality.
No. Locke's model secures rights, but it does not eliminate structural disparities in power or wealth. His framework assumes a society of property holders capable of rational judgment and participation. Later, critics would argue that economic inequality can undermine the very consent on which legitimacy depends. Still, Locke's contribution lies in redefining political obedience as conditional rather than absolute. Authority must justify itself continuously through protection of rights. A government that ceases to serve its purpose dissolves the moral bond that sustains it.
So the stability of power depends on its restraint.
Yes, for Locke, limitation is not a threat to order, but its precondition. In the end, Locke does not present a dramatic solution to political conflict. He offers instead a structural principle. Power is legitimate only when it remains within defined limits. Those limits are not imposed by tradition alone, nor by force, but by natural rights and consent.
So authority becomes conditional.
Yes, conditional authority changes the psychological structure of political life. Citizens are no longer subjects of inherited command, but participants in a civil arrangement grounded in mutual obligation. Government is transformed from a permanent hierarchy into a trust sustained by performance. This does not eliminate conflict. Disagreement remains inevitable, but it reframes conflict within a legal structure rather than leaving it to force.
So limitation becomes a form of stability.
Exactly. For Locke, limits are not signs of weakness but mechanisms of durability. By insisting that rulers answer to law and consent, he shifts sovereignty from a person to a framework. The lasting consequence of this shift is constitutional government. Power becomes defined not by its reach but by its restraint.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Locke thought about limiting power, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with 2 treatises of government by John Locke.
So this is the core political text.
Yes. It lays out his argument that political authority comes from consent, and that government exists to protect natural rights.
Is it accessible to modern readers?
It requires patience, but the structure is clear. Locke builds his case step by step against absolute power.
So reading it reveals the foundation directly.
Exactly. To understand limited government, it is best to encounter the argument in its original form.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
After Locke's death in 1704, his ideas did not remain confined to English political debate. They traveled through pamphlets, parliamentary arguments, and eventually across the Atlantic. In the American colonies, Locke's language of natural rights and consent became part of revolutionary discourse. The claim that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed reflects his structure almost directly.
So his theory became constitutional practice.
Yes, written constitutions, separation of powers, and rights protections echo Locke's insistence that authority must be limited by law. In the 18th and 19th centuries, liberal movements across Europe invoked his framework against absolutist regimes. Yet his legacy was not without complication. His emphasis on property strengthened arguments for economic freedom, but also intersected with emerging capitalist structures that produced inequality. Later critics questioned whether consent could remain meaningful in societies marked by structural imbalance.
So limitation raises new tensions.
Exactly. Locke resolved the problem of absolute monarchy, but opened questions about representation, inclusion, and economic justice. Modern democratic systems continue to rely on his central premise that power must justify itself. Debates about executive authority, emergency powers, and constitutional limits still echo his framework.
So the question remains active.
Yes. Locke transformed power from a permanent right into a conditional trust. That shift continues to define how modern societies understand legitimacy, resistance, and constitutional order.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the structure of limited power.
Thank you, Clara. Some political ideas endure because they redefine the terms of authority itself.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.